Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans, and as an intro to the video that follows, I need to give you a bit of background. Okay. Now, before we get into the background, I have to tell you, I have a confession to make. I've told you before that the media have told me that I'm a racist and I'm anti-Semitic and all sorts of awful things. And I think I've countered that. I think my Fiji Homestays project, helping thousands of indigenous black Fijians actually get out of poverty and use the hospitality industry to get themselves moving forward, is proof of that, and I'll put a link below where you can see that. But I'm only doing that to cover my own ass because I know what the friggin' media are like, okay? So just get that. Just get that in your head. Now, in the video that follows, we have a very, very interesting development which could be very, very good for South Africans. And we need to look at how we can make this work for us, okay? Here's the situation. There is a party in Australia called One Nation. I was the party's webmaster in the 1990s, and I actually wrote the book called Murder by Media, and I'll see if I can find the PDF, and I'll link the PDF below so you can pull it up and read it for yourself. But it exposes how false and fake the mainstream media are when they're trying to protect their narrative. Now, the interesting thing is that in the Labour Party, which is, if you think of the four corners of politics, okay, you got the left and the right, you got the middle. The left is the Labour Party, and the right, in the extreme, would be the One Nation Party, because they're looking after the people in the country. Now, Mark Latham, who features in the video, was actually the Prime Minister of Australia for a short while for the Labour Party. And he is now advocating for the extreme right, the One Nation Party, as the leader of the One Nation Party in New South Wales. I don't know how that computes, but that's what's going on. But in the video, he makes a lot of sense. And a lot of this relates to what's going on in South Africa. And that's why I'm putting this video up. Okay, I'm going to just read my notes here. Okay, so in this video with Bolt and Latham, Latham talks about employment being on an equal opportunity basis. Get rid of race, sex, anything else. It's what your qualifications are. That's the only dividing line. And he talks about here, even here in Australia, where we have identity politics, where if you're a certain color or a certain gender, they can put ads up which sort of say, hey, if you fall into this area, we're going to give you preferential treatment. And it's not a lot of the ads in Australia, but there's some that do that, and they're mainly governmental. And the point that Mark Latham is making is that employment qualities, like saying that, you know, if you're Aboriginal or you are a female or you are a gay person, you're going to get preferential treatment, is basically illegal. And as a result of these affirmative action policies, which South Africa is probably the classic case right now where, if you're not black or coloured, don't even apply, okay? You're not going to get the job. And what Latham is saying is that what they're doing is watering down the training requirements of people. And we had that classic case earlier of that woman from SARS, who is now head of the IT department in SARS, which is the tax revenue department in the most the most developmental area of that organization, which is online IT, and she doesn't know what the hell she's talking about. And that's because of affirmative action. So getting onto what's happening here. So sorry guys, it's dark here, my eyes are not great. But what he's actually saying is that a lot of white men in Australia, and we're talking mainly about governmental jobs, have been locked out of these jobs because of race or sex or whatever, because they've got these little quotas they've got to try and meet to satisfy the wider liberal population. And he's calling for a ban for affirmative action. So what I want to do in this video is set up a new acronym. You got BEE? Well, I've got a new one. BAA, ban affirmative action. And if you don't ban affirmative action in South Africa, look no further than what's going on in the East London region. The country is going to go down the cesspool. Now, the video follows, but please subscribe to be kept informed. And remember, this Sunday we have a couple of very, very interesting conversations going on with people regarding things happening in South Africa. Okay, guys, take care and have a lovely day.
Now, back live with Andrew Bolt with the Bolt Report.
SBS, taxpayer funded, is going to run yet another documentary about how women are suffering and men are beasts. Here is some of the preview.
Is life in a lucky country actually harder for a woman than it is for a man? A startling report suggests it is. Australia has tumbled down international rankings and now sits lower than some developing countries for gender equality. So we've commissioned the largest survey ever undertaken on the issue, and its findings are shocking.
Wow, that's shocking indeed if you believe their data, because if you believe they've told the whole truth, the survey for SBS claims that 60% of women aged up to 25 have experienced gender inequality. Now, 40% say they've been sexually harassed in public in just the past year. That's incredible, isn't it? When you think of all those anti-discrimination laws and tribunals and all those education campaigns and the Me Too movement, the lot, how is this even possible? But wait. The company that made this stocko for SBS, Joined Up Films, had meant to make a more balanced program about sexism, and they would be interviewing Bettina Arndt, a psychologist and a facts-based conservative. In fact, they did interview her, and the reason for that was that this survey for SBS had actually found something that cut right across that message that you just saw in that promo. It also found that almost half those surveyed felt feminism had actually gone too far, and 3/4 felt men suffer from sexism too. But guess what? Those stats and Bettina Arndt's interview were dropped from the documentary. Joining me a little earlier was former Labor leader Mark Latham, now head of One Nation in New South Wales and running for a seat in the New South Wales Upper House. Mark Latham, thanks for joining me. Are you surprised that SBS didn't want that side of the story in its documentary?
Well, Andrew, unfortunately, that's the way the left do media these days. If it doesn't fit the narrative, they drop it out. And their narrative is to promote victimhood among women, that women are struggling, women are suffering, and so-called white male privilege is a force for oppression, that men are sexual predators, men are naturally aggressive, men are antisocial. I mean, this is the narrative that's out there, and it's an abomination in terms of fairness, because you go to any public housing estate, you'll come across a bunch of white men in particular who are really struggling in life, restructured out of manufacturing jobs in the 80s and 90s and long-term welfare dependent, really struggling. I mean, the only way you can run a fair society is judge people on merit and need, and this is the great flaw in identity politics that subdivides our society on the basis of race, gender and sexuality.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, the presenter ends up in this documentary in tears at the thought of her children facing such sexism against women. I think she should have been weeping that she fronted such an unbalanced story. But to that point that you make, this to me is the contradiction in identity politics. It says to address a real or imagined oppression of a class of people, regardless of their individual circumstances, because many may not in fact be oppressed, we are going to be unfair to another class of people, which generally involves being unfair to an individual. To address a group prejudice or so, suffering, you're actually unfair to a particular individual, like the well-credentialed man will not get that job. How unfair is that?
Well, it's a real problem. They're trying to counter old perceived forms of discrimination by creating new forms of discrimination. So in net terms, society is still discriminating. And this is the fundamental flaw in identity politics, the way it tries to create collective categories based on race, gender and sexuality. And it's a flaw reflected in left feminism today. Feminism in the 60s had a lot of success in empowering women and girls. But today, the message for girls in particular is be a victim, have grievance, plead for special treatment in the system. Yet your average Australian woman is powering ahead, Andrew. The statistics show that women are now in the majority of university graduates. We've got more women than male lawyers, GP doctors, vets, teachers, office managers, public servants in Australia. In vocations of choice, women are powering ahead. So I'm afraid the SBS left feminist narrative is all wrong and doesn't reflect Australian realities today.
But the sexism against men, I mean, you feel a bit of a wuss as a male complaining about it, because we're obviously socialised to think, men have got to do the stiff upper lip and we've got to take the knocks and, all right, they rage at us kind of thing. I'm not denying sexism against women, by the way, but the sexism against men or the unfairness or discrimination against men, how serious is that, do you really think?
Well, it's being entrenched. It's being established in government policies and departmental practices. Discriminatory employment quotas are becoming a way of life in the Australian workplace, public and private sector. And look at something like the New South Wales Fire Brigade, where there was a deliberate strategy to water down the training requirements to allow women in. Obviously, it's a job where strength matters, and men would normally be regarded, all other things being equal, as very suitable for the job, but they can't get in because of the employment quotas and the watering down of the training requirements. But it goes beyond gender, Andrew, because when we talk about the Australian fair go, what do we really mean? We talk about the principle of merit, meritocracy, that the best person for the job should always get the job regardless of race, gender and sexuality. So as soon as you move away from that and you create new forms of discrimination, in this case locking white men out of jobs, very often they're described as stale, pale males. I mean, what a terrible, terrible thing to have said about a generation of men in Australia, but that's the reality now, and it's incredibly serious. This stuff needs to be stopped.
Now, you sent me a document that you're releasing today, your New South Wales One Nation policy, that seems to tackle these sorts of issues. What's the highlight here for you?
Well, it's a policy that combats identity politics. It says that merit is more important than employment quotas. It says that free speech and religious freedom need to be entrenched in law. And at its core, this policy is saying that the human rights framework in Australia needs to be modernised, because in the 70s and 80s, the strategy was to select some so-called minorities and say, you need protection under the law from discrimination. But now, whether we're talking about the persecution of Christians or men or white people, unfortunately, the political side of some of the minorities have used their newfound opportunities in society to take revenge against perceived problems with groups you might think of as majorities. And this is a policy to end the newfound leftist discrimination against men, boys, Christians, white people, because it's creeping right through our institutions at an incredible rate, and we need to return to principles of merit, freedom and opportunity.
Well, one of the things in your policy that I think is where the teeth of it sort of come out are where you say you're going to ban quotas and positive discrimination, all those programs that reserve or prefer jobs for certain people based on race or religion, or no, not so much religion, I guess, but that too. But race and gender, how's that going to work, do you think?
Well, we should be making employment quotas illegal. We should have a human right of equal opportunity and treatment on merit under the law. And you can't run a society, a cohesive society, on the basis that one group are going to be identified as subject to persecution because of perceived past grievances, and you're going to create new forms of discrimination to deal with old forms. I mean, this is a recipe for social fragmentation. The only way you can run a fair, cohesive society is on merit. Treat people not according to their identity categories, the collective approach, treat them on their individual merit. And when we talk about minorities, the smallest minority in any society is the individual. And unfortunately, for an individual in Australia today that's classified as a straight white male, it's a terrible time for your treatment in institutions where you, and particularly worry about our sons, they can do well at school, they can get great results at university, but they're not going to get a fair go in life. They're going to be discriminated against under these employment quotas, and they've got to be made illegal. I mean, all forms of discrimination are bad, and discriminating against meritorious fellows, young men, because of their skin colour and their gender is just plain wrong.
What about an ad that says, and I've seen them, you know, the ABC, for instance, this job we would prefer goes to an Aboriginal person, or an SBS ad that says we would prefer these jobs to go to someone of immigrant background, or the ABC having that policy recently of having people preferring to employ people who've got an accent, or public service jobs that say, you know, these jobs we like to go to minorities, all those sorts of things. Are they going to be banned in New South Wales if your proposal got up?
Yes, I believe in equal employment opportunity, and reserving jobs for people of a certain colour, a certain gender, a certain sexuality, a certain way of speaking is obviously a policy that defies equal employment opportunity. And this is one of the shortfalls in the current human rights framework, because whether you're talking state level in New South Wales, our Anti-Discrimination Board, or federally with the Human Rights Commission, all of these new forms of discrimination are being legitimised under the law under what they call special measures or exemptions. If you want to reserve a certain job for an Aboriginal woman, obviously that's a form of discrimination against everyone else. They can't apply on merit under equality for that job. And an exemption.
What if you do want to help an Aboriginal woman?
Well, I think we need to create opportunities in the education system and helping Indigenous communities in substantial ways without reserving employment positions and finding new forms of discrimination that fragment society, cause enormous bitterness from those who can't compete for the job. And quite frankly, if you want to get ahead in any job in Australia, get a good education, put your application in, interview well, and show people that on merit and your hard work, you're the person for the job. And you can't run a system any other way, otherwise you'd be reserving every single job for a group according to skin colour, according to gender. It's such a primitive, unnecessary, wrong way of dealing with social justice questions. We've got to have equality of opportunity in Australia, not equality of outcomes, according to some sort of racial commissar who's dedicating what sort of person and skin colour can go into a particular job.
Mark Latham, as always, a great pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Andrew.